In the long shadow of the dragon throne, where silence could be more powerful than speech and silk whispers more dangerous than swords, the imperial body sat not merely as a sovereign over men, but as a node of cosmic balance, a living altar to which history attached meaning not just of conquest or order, but of flesh and heat and rhythm. The body of the emperor was not his own. It was the property of heaven, an embodiment of the mandate itself, and everything he did, especially in the shadowed confines of the bed, echoed far beyond walls of jade and vermilion. What we might think of as private acts were never quite private, not in the Forbidden City, not with 1,000 eyes and fabric and anticipation. The Forbidden City during the Qing dynasty expanded this structure to terrifying exactness. The Empress held rank, but her influence in the bedroom was often ceremonial. The concubines of lower rank often vied for real power. For pregnancy brought not just motherhood, but the elevation of their families and entire clans. Thus, sexuality was not always indulgence. It was survival and ambition, and sometimes an elaborate performance with the emperor as both actor and audience. And when dynasties began to collapse, as they all did eventually, the historians often cited excess as a cause, not just excess in taxation or war, but in lust and in the fall of the Shang, the debauchery of King Zhou with his consort, Dodgy the collapse of the temps blamed in part on the young Gufei. These were not just moral tales, they were erotic allegories of disorder, where sex became the metaphor for all that had gone wrong. His body was not his own, nor were his desires. His arousal, his restraint, his aging flesh, all became symbols in a language that governed more than just courtiers or concubines. Their presence allowed intimacy to remain distant and dangerous to remain safe. We will trace how desire was choreographed. Was it sacred or strategic, spontaneous or scripted? The answer floats somewhere between all those truths. Because, in a world where a single moan might signal the will of heaven, every touch became a kind of ritual. Every body a text to be read by scholars, astrologers, physicians, and ghosts. Forbidden, how bodies were used as instruments of dynasty and doctrine, how power bled into pleasure and back again. We begin not with scandal, but with balance, not with sin, but with strategy, not with titillation, but with history's most intimate choreography. These figures will be with us later in this journey, for they shaped the very logistics of imperial sex, documenting it, managing it, sometimes manipulating it. Their silence, too, was a kind of power. It shaped how ordinary people married, how they prayed, how they conceived, how they mourned. For if the emperor abstained, so might they. If the emperor favored multiple women, then so might the ministers. If the emperor issued edicts condemning same-sex love or female pleasure, those ripples extended into family law, into village gossip, into temple ritual. What happened behind the lacquered doors of the palace reached even the remote corners of the empire in the form of proverbs or punishments, or paintings on porcelain, and 1,000 scrolls and 1,000 interpretations unfurling around a single breath of pleasure, sometimes unwilling, often ambitious, occasionally triumphant. They existed in the margins between history and silence, their names often lost, their bodies subjected to inspections, schedules, purifications, They bathed in dragon-scented oils and wore robes, stitched with gold threads. Yet many of them were never touched, never called, never remembered, and still they waited because being chosen even once could change a family. As fate forever, the lucky few who bore sons might gain brief favor. The others returned to obscurity or bitterness, or quiet companionship with one another, creating delicate alliances or rivalries as invisible as the perfumes they wore. It is said that in the Ming court concubines were taught how to walk, how to smile, how to speak softly, if their every word could either elevate or condemn them to years of loneliness. Sex in imperial China was not only biological nor purely pleasurable. It was cosmological, it was medicinal, it was ritual. A union between emperor and concubine was also a union between heaven and earth, between yin and yang, between balance and renewal. Emperors were encouraged to read sexual manuals, crafted by Taoist sages' texts, like the Sun Dijing or the classic of the Plain Girl, which blended anatomical observations with spiritual allegory. These manuals did not speak of lust, but of equilibrium. The act of sex was to be neither rushed nor withheld, but perfected, tuned like a zither string, so it would resonate across the bureaucratic lattice of empire. The Plain Girl counseled on rhythm, on breath control, on the number of thrusts, on the seasons themselves. She warned against excess and against the loss of essence in ejaculation, a belief that later evolved into the strange medical faith that abstaining from climax preserved life. Well, climax hastened death. The emperor's semen was not mere fluid. It was imperial inheritance. It was dynastic potential. It was metaphysical capital. That which happened in candlelight was understood to influence the rise and fall of dynasties, the fertility of the fields, the harmony of the stars within Taoist tradition. Sex was more than intimacy, it was technique. It was preservation of essence, or DJing, and transmutation of energy. The emperor was expected to engage in regulated sexual activity, not to please himself, but to nourish his own ki, his life force, and by extension the entire empire's vitality. Taoist alchemists whispered through palatial corridors, describing ways to extract the yin essence of women to strengthen the yang of men, not with violence, but with choreography, with intention, with breath. In the early Han period, these beliefs were enshrined in the emperor's routine, and the joining of bodies was seen as the continuation of cosmic cycles, not a deviation from them. The first Han emperor, Liu Bang, who founded the dynasty in 206 BC, was said to be visited by a golden deity in the shape of a woman who taught him sexual methods that would grant longevity and clarity. And so, across the ages, the imperial bed became both a throne and an altar, a place of statecraft as real as the grand. Council chamber concubines were not lovers, they were conduits. Their selection and scheduling were acts of governance, not romance. The Temps dynasty in particular saw a flourishing of sensual poetry and artistic depictions of intimacy under like Xuanzong, who made love and aesthetics interchangeable. Yet even at its most decadent, sex remained supervised. Even behind silk screens, the act was recorded not with illustrations but with names, dates, positions, all for posterity or scrutiny or astrology. The Bureau of Astronomy consulted charts to determine the most auspicious night for conception, because the child of a poorly timed union might be cursed, or barren, or worse. Yet what appears as cold bureaucracy was not without its strange tenderness. The emperor's pleasure was also the realm's peace. The wombs of concubines were not only anatomical, but political and celestial. Each dynasty approached these beliefs with variations, but they all adhered to the larger cosmology. In the Ming era, for example, Emperor Yongle institutionalized the rotation of concubines, so that the emperor would sleep with a different woman each night, but only in accordance with a strict schedule, ensuring no one woman monopolized his key or his attention. This system became a machine unto itself, a clock of flesh. There were, of course, deviation stories that slipped through the bureaucratic sieve: emperors who loved truly and madly, emperors who were indifferent or impotent, emperors who fled their responsibilities or drowned in them, but even their failures were interpreted cosmologically. A barren emperor signaled heaven's displeasure. A sexually insatiable emperor was seen as destabilizing the harmony of yin and yang. These failures were not seen as personal. They were national, spiritual, historical. At the center of this cosmology was the belief that the emperor was the singular bridge between heaven and earth. But to speak only of emperors, to ignore the women whose lives were folded into this choreography, and surrounding them all were the watchers, the eunuchs whose lives were defined by the boundary between sex and no sex, guardians of the threshold, neither fully male nor entirely erased. And so we begin this strange dream walk through red corridors and candlelight, through brocade beds and embroidered instructions, through poetry that described the curve of an ankle as a national treasure, and scrolls that spoke of intercourse as an alchemical rite. Was sex in imperial China an act of love, or law of duty or desire? Let us step further now beyond the curtains and into the chamber where breath was studied, like scripture, where time itself was measured in heartbeats and silk rustle, and where the emperor's body became the kingdom's calendar. The imperial bedchamber was not merely a space of repose, it was a temple of quiet power, a chamber where time thickened and breath slowed, where the shadows on the lac screens stretched long and trembled like the silk of prayer. Flags in a windless shrine, plain girl, spoke in riddles of pulse and essence, and rhythm of thrust and breath and absorption. The joining of two bodies was not for union, it was for transformation. He must master his own rhythm, like a musician tuning an instrument until the sound matched the sky, until the motion echoed the movement of the stars. For the health of the empire depended on his restraint. He was not to reach the peak, but to float near it, to circle it, to draw close, and then recede like the tide. They drank infusions of deer horn and tortoise, shell and musk and lotus root. To increase their fire, they lay with concubines, chosen not for their beauty, but for their energy. That silence, too, was part of the ritual, a space in which to feel the movement of ki or the absence of it. The imperial physicians would arrive at dawn and measure the pulse again and study the tongue and examine the emperor's gaze to see if the night had restored or drained him, and they would record it in long scrolls and hide them in cedar boxes where they might sleep for 1,000 years. Their bodies were measured not in curves, but in pulse. And then when the floods came, or the rice failed, or the rebels marched, the people said it was because the emperor had spent too much and absorbed too little, because he had lost his seed into the earth, instead of holding it like fire in his bones. Some women were believed to carry a stronger yin, and were summoned to restore the emperor's strength after days of governance. Things not said but known, certain seasons when sex was forbidden, certain nights when the stars crossed in such a way that even touch was dangerous. There were herbs to suppress desire, there were meditations to dissolve arousal, and who ceased to govern not from laziness but from discipline, who believed that by preserving their energy they preserved the state, and who let ministers rule while they sat still as statues in chambers, scented with sandalwood, imagining the shapes of their own key, as it rose like smoke above the city. For theirs was a different rhythm, a different silence, and their own breath must be remembered in the next unfolding. There were emperors who fasted from sex for years to increase their inner heat, and some believed that true power came not from joining with many women. They were buried with their concubines, and their scrolls, and their silence. And the historians wrote their names with regret and mystery, and always with a question, to whether they had failed or merely misread the rhythm, but from holding all desire within, as a pearl held inside the mouth, untouched, unfed, and eternal. Others were avoided because their energy ran cold or sharp or restless. The night was not for indulgence. It was for repair. Each woman he entered was not a concubine. She was a vessel of yin, and the purpose was not satisfaction but refinement. The art of the bed was not for the night, but for the age. Her breath was timed, her heart was monitored, her womb was a vessel, her blood a current. The Taoist manuals spoke of ideal shapes, of ideal rhythms, of the way her moan must rise like a flute, and her hips must follow the pattern of falling rain, and her skin must be soft, not from lotions, but from balanced ki. And when she wept, it was not always from pain or passion, but from imbalance of fire and water in her body. And the emperor was to learn these signs, as a scholar reads a sacred text. She taught that the man must not climax, that the woman must receive and bloom, that their essences must mingle without loss. Each encounter was a ritual, a chemical equation performed in the dark. The man who lost his seed lost his life. The man who preserved it grew radiant and could live through dynasties. What happened? There was never simply between man and woman, not in the palace. Not when the bed itself was carved from centuries, and the moonlight entered like a witness. The emperor was not alone in his longing nor in his stillness, for he lay at the intersection of two great rivers, the river of dynasty and the river of Tao, and both demanded obedience, not pleasure. They lived in mountain caves and watched the breath of flowers and the decay of stone. They wrote books that few could read and fewer understood, but the palace sent for them in secret, them rooms near the court, and fed them meals on jade platters, because their knowledge was more precious than gold. Their scrolls describe the difference between 9 strokes and 13. The value of mourning, breath the shape of a woman's ankle as it pertained to fortune. They warned of dangers not from battle but from imbalance, from ejaculation, from love-making in the wrong season, from desire without discipline. The alchemy of desire was not for pleasure, it was for balance, it was for eternity. The ancient masters whispered that the body was a furnace, and the breath its bellows and desire the spark to light it. Taoist alchemists spoke not in the language of sin or virtue, but in the dialect of energy, of cycles of harmony and distortion. And so the emperor was trained not in conquest but in delay, not in domination but in control. And those who taught these methods did not wear silk. They wore ash. Some emperors followed these teachings with devotion. They counted their breaths. They kept charts of their body's warmth and its stillness. And yet no one could measure the silence after those acts, when the candles dimmed, and the woman was gone, and the emperor sat alone with his own pulse still ringing in his ears. In this world of alchemical sex, the woman was more than a participant. She was an instrument, but there were also taboos, great silences in the manuals. Yet not all emperors could sustain this discipline. Some laughed at the old teachings, they drank wine and broke schedules. They summoned 10 concubines a night and left them broken and pale, and the scrolls recorded their decline in vague poetry, and the court whispered of imbalance and heaven's disfavor. In some dynasties the influence of Taoist alchemy reached even into law, into architecture, into burial rites. The shape of the palace was built around flows of energy, the gardens designed to absorb and distribute yin and yang, the chambers arranged so that intimacy would occur in the direction of the rising sun or the full moon. The furniture of sex was not casual. Some beds were carved with turtles and cranes, symbols of longevity and balance. Others were simple mats on the floor meant to connect the body directly with the breath of the earth. Some rooms were scented with herbs, chosen not for aroma but for alignment, and the burning of incense was timed to the cycle of the breath, not the ticking of any clock. And when a woman became pregnant, the question was not only whose child it was, but when it had been conceived and under which stars and after which union, and whether the emperor had followed the right rhythm. If he had, then the child was blessed, and might be the future. If he had not, then the child was suspect, and some were quietly sent away or died before they could be named. The imperial body was thus a sight of intense attention, and yet it remained a mystery even to itself. For how can one know whether the pulse is true or only desired to be true? How can one say whether the energy is rising or falling, when so many eyes are watching, so many voices predicting, so many scrolls recording? The emperor was alone in his own body, and that solitude was part of the ritual. To the Taoist texts spoke often of solitude, of meditation, of withdrawal, of the deep breath taken before the moment of union, of the silence that followed the climax, not felt but withheld, of the light behind the eyes, when the breath stops and returns and stops again. And there were emperors who vanished into this study, who became obsessed with breathing and ritual and the balance of their own seed and essence. Others disappeared in another way, drowning in desire, forgetting the teachings, abandoning the rhythm and falling into illness, and forgetting and sleep. We carry on now from this chamber of stillness to the women who lived within it, the concubines, the empresses, the vessels of yin who were both adored and ignored, exalted and erased. They were called precious things, and fragrant ones, and flowers behind screens, and yet they were women with lungs, and hair, and silence, pressed deep into their flesh. The imperial harem was a garden without weather, a labyrinth, where time bloomed in circles, where seasons came and went. But the walls did not change, and the moon rose behind. Latticed windows that no one opened, the concubines arrived young, usually, and with names that were not their own, renamed like teacups or silk colours. They were chosen for the way their eyelids tilted, or the softness of their walk, for how they stood in stillness, or laughed once, and never again. They did not see the emperor at first, nor even for many months. They were trained, not in books, but in how to walk in rhythm, how to bow in grace, how to conceal a thought within the space between two breaths. Their voices were tuned to the same pitch, their hair combed with the same oils, their dreams shaped by the same cold water poured from the same bronze basin. In the morning they whispered poems, and in the evening they painted their wrists with paste that smelled of flowers and faint hunger. They lived in a dormitory of velvet and distance, and waited to be called like a scroll placed on a shelf, just slightly askew. The emperor did not call at random. The names were chosen by court eunuchs from slips of wood or silk, and the chosen woman would bathe 3 times and be inspected by women with hands like porcelain. Their duties were sacred, not sensual. The concubine's body was a site of potential, not passion, and she was to arrive, wrapped in brocade, carried sometimes on the back of a eunuch, so that her feet would not touch the ground. The chamber was warm, the bed was wide, the light dimmed to resemble a dusk that never ended. And if she was spoken to, it was rarely by name. Some women became favorites and were summoned more often, and their names whispered down corridors with envy and calculation. Others were never called and grew old in silence. Their beauty waned, and their names were forgotten. And they took 2 feeding birds from the windows, or tending 2 miniature gardens of moss and stone. Some wrote poems in the margins of their robes with invisible ink. Some etched their thoughts into combs or hairpins, or the soles of their shoes, hoping someone would find them centuries later and wonder who had written of sadness in the shape of a plum blossom. The Empress stood above them all, and yet she too was subject to the same winds of favour and disfavour. She had borne a child, perhaps, or none. Her power lay not in passion, but in lineage, in etiquette, in being slightly more still than the rest. Her chamber was larger, her robes heavier, her sorrow quieter. She was the moon to their stars. And yet her light was not always her own. They held the secrets of the palace in their folded hands, and knew who was favoured, who was feared, who wept at night, and who prayed to gods no longer named. Some wrote poetry in secret, some concubines smiled with too many teeth, some shared tea laced with knowledge, some painted each other's nails while dreaming of knives. Most said nothing and looked straight ahead, for to speak was to risk, and to be silent was to survive. And yet they were not always cruel nor always kind. They formed bonds like silk threads, delicate and quick, and sometimes stronger than steel. They whispered stories to each other at night of villagers they barely remembered, of brothers they had once known, of stars that burned in places beyond the palace walls. Some sang lullabies to empty corridors, some vanished, and no one asked where they had gone, for the palace was full of doors that led to nowhere and everywhere. At once she smiled less and listened more, and sometimes when she was alone she would stroke the embroidery of her gown, as though the Phoenix might whisper to her of flight. Pregnancy was both triumph and terror. A concubine who conceived became a star for a season, and was then watched more closely than ever, for her child might be the next emperor or a rival to one already born. She was moved to special quarters, given food with care, and visited by physicians who took her pulse with reverence and dread. But some pregnancies disappeared without notice. Some infants were born blue and silent, and were carried away before dawn. Others thrived for a moment, then vanished into the arms of wet nurses, who aged quickly and spoke to no one. And the mothers were given more silk and more silence, and told to rest as though rest were an answer. The eunuchs moved like ghosts between these women, guarding and gossiping, and sometimes loving too, for they had once been boys with dreams. And now they were shadows with keys. Rivalries bloomed like night blooming jasmine, not seen but smelled. Art was their salvation and their mirror. They painted fans with the shapes of dreams. They embroidered despair into the hems of their gowns. They learned to play the zither and the flute, and their fingers moved not just with skill but with longing. Some wrote plays and acted them in shadows behind screens. Some carved dolls from fruit pits and gave them names. Some trained pet crickets and sang to them lullabies that no mother ever heard in art. They found themselves not as consorts, but as women, as breath, as fleeting as dew on the morning plum. Death came softly and often. A fever here, a fall there, a poisoning whispered behind a curtain. Sometimes a woman simply vanished, and her name was never spoken again. The palace kept no graves, only memories written in the air, and footsteps in dust. Some concubines were buried in silk, others in whispers. Some became spirits who walked the corridors in brocade feet, never touching the ground, waiting perhaps for a name to be remembered, or a poem to be found. And the palace absorbed them all like a great mouth swallowing time and scent and silence. In rare moments they escaped, not through doors but through dreams. One woman dreamt of flying above the palace, her sleeves becoming wings. Another of walking barefoot through snow that did not melt. Another of singing a song so perfect that the walls crumbled and light poured in like water. These dreams were passed like heirlooms from one woman to another, and some believed they were true, that someone once had walked out, that someone once had flown, that the walls remembered and would someday open if the right note was sung or the right tear shed at the right hour. The harem was not a prison but a pattern, a web of ritual and longing and forgotten names. It was a place where power was soft and slow, where time did not march but curled and flickered like incense. And yet within that stillness were hearts that beat, and hands that reached, and eyes that sometimes saw beyond the screen. Some of these women died in silence, some in song, some in madness, some in peace. But all had once stood in the center of the empire, even if no one said their name. We now drift forward into the shadows of those who watched over these women, those who recorded their names or erased them, who judged from within and without the imperial keep. Some grew powerful beyond the grasp of ministers. Their loyalty was bought and sold. Like jade, they could bless or ruin a concubine with a single nod. They could delay an audience, or permit one that changed the course of war or peace. Some oversaw fleets that reached the ends of the earth, like Zeng, he whose voyagers traced the edges of the known world while his own body carried the mark of court control. There were those who comforted a weeping girl in the dark or passed secret messages between locked rooms. A eunuch might love quietly, might betray carefully, might risk everything for the scent of a wrist or the trace of a smile. And when discovered, the punishment was beyond death. It was erasure. Body vanished, and the name, too, and sometimes even the memory of the event was blotted out with silence. He sailed in silk and salt, and his body remained loyal to the palace, even as his ships defied gravity and tide. There were eunuchs who built palaces, planted gardens, wrote laws, and overthrew empires. Their schedules were written in ink that did not smudge. Their days were filled with attending to the Emperor S3X and the Empress rituals and the concubines' cycles. They oversaw the purification of chambers, the cleansing of sheets, the blessing of beds. They burned incense to ward off bad dreams. They arranged the pillows to avoid bad omens. They chose the oils and scented the air, and measured time with water clocks that dripped in rhythm with desire. They had no sons, no families, no future, and so their ambition was shaped like a mirror, polished to reflect only survival. They were the last to leave the chamber after a night of duty, the first to know when something had gone wrong. They brushed the hair of women they could not touch. One wrote of being both necessary and invisible, another of praying to a bodhisattva with no mouth. Their writings are fragments, but they shimmer with the truth that they were not empty, not hollow, but human. Theirs was a body shaped by power, not nature, and their hearts beat like anyone else. As they saw the Emperor's eyes soften and could not mirror that gaze. They were surrounded by music and scent and beauty and remained untouched, uninvited. They sometimes dreamed of voices calling their names or hands reaching for theirs. But they woke with the taste of salt on their lips and no one in the dark. If a concubine became ill, they summoned doctors. If a child was conceived, they confirmed the blood. If a mood soured, they managed the aftermath. Their power was the power of knowing what should never be said. Some emperors trusted them more than their sons, more than their wives, more than the gods. They might have pressed a warm hand to a chilled forehead, or combed out hair with gentleness born of devotion, not duty. He served Emperor Xuanzong and guarded the Emperor's beloved young Gaifei, not just with obedience, but with precision. He arranged the meetings, prepared the rooms, controlled the timing. His name was etched into poems and lamented in exile, because he understood that power moved through the corridors of intimacy. They were the eunuchs of the imperial court, and though their bodies had been altered, they had not been emptied. They were men who had been turned into vessels, into gates, into silence itself. They managed the rotation of concubines, the washing of linens, the maintenance of incense and light. They administered perfume and privacy. They ensured that the emperor's pleasure did not disrupt the order of heaven. Their job was not desire, but detail. Their duty was not passion. Preservation. They ensured that intimacy served the empire, not the individual. Their lives began with a blade, and from that wound was born a profession of shadows and breath and unwavering control. They knew who had been summoned and who had been forgotten, and when and why. They knew when an heir had likely been conceived, and when nothing had happened at all. Their ledgers were sacred and secret. Their records showed the rhythm of a dynasty through sheets and schedules. But they were not merely servants. They whispered into ears that mattered and moved messages that shaped decisions. There were those who used their position to manipulate pleasure. In the Ming dynasty, there were eunuchs who built empires within empires. Some eunuchs loved the emperor, and that love was not always named. It was not always spoken, but it colored their gaze and guided their choices. Others formed secret bonds with concubines themselves, forbidden and fraught. These were not tales told aloud, but they lingered in the margins of palace gossip. Their quarters were sparse, their lives regimented. They ate little and slept less. They became the keepers of secrets and the archivists of the intimate empire. And yet, they were also lonely. They lived among desire, but did not partake of it. Some eunuchs wrote memoirs coded in metaphor, shaped by caution. Their writings tell of loyalty and labor, but also of pain and complexity. In times of dynastic turmoil, eunuchs were often blamed for excess and decline. They became scapegoats for emperors who had lost touch with ritual, for concubines who gained too much influence, for palaces that grew too decadent. They were accused of corruption, of witchcraft, of controlling the throne from behind the bedchamber curtain. In truth, some did and some did not. But the myth was stronger than the man, and history remembered them as monsters more than men. Their end came slowly as dynasties fell, as new rulers distrusted them, as revolutions abolished the architecture of intimacy. The Qing court saw their numbers diminish, their tasks became bureaucratic, their secrets fewer, their voices dimmer. In the final years of the empire, eunuchs still lived in the palace, but they had little to watch, little to guard. The emperor's needs had changed, the concubines were fewer, the silence deeper. Now we move from the shadows into the spotlight, from those who kept the doors to those who walked through them, from those who recorded to those who were recorded in red ink and whispered poetry. In the highest room of the tallest tower, the emperor does not sleep. He lies awake as moonlight drips onto lacquered floors and silk rustles like wind in the curtains. He is not dreaming because dreams would mean rest, and he is not rested in years. The empire rests on his breath, on his blood, on his appetite, and so he eats, and he listens, and he waits for pleasure to speak his name. He is the son of heaven, but also the son of shadow and desire. He summoned musicians to play her lullabies and ordered that her favorite lychee fruit be delivered from the southern provinces on horseback in a relay of speed and sweat and loyalty. He would not eat if she did not smile, he would not rule if she wept. The Ming Emperor Shend built a secret garden within the forbidden city where the rules of court did not apply. He disguised himself as a commoner, wandered among brothels and wine shops, and brought actors and courtesans into his sanctuary. He declared one of them Empress in play, if not in decree, and dressed himself in foreign robes while the ministers despaired. He read every document himself, wrote comments in red ink, and had spies watching even the spies. He forbade certain words in public speech and punished ministers who used metaphors. He believed that the empire was a mechanism and he alone held the key. He collected texts that no one else could read and consulted astrologers who spoke in riddles. He wrote poems about tea leaves and critiqued the brushwork of ancient masters. He held banquets, but spent more time alone with seals than with servants. He believed that order was aesthetic, and that an empire was best preserved through cataloguing, not conquest. He reigned long and wrote much, but his heart lived in objects, not people. And when he died, the archive he left behind was heavier than any crown. The Emperor's body was sacred, and surveilled his dreams mattered to ministers. His sighs could be transcribed into law, and his laughter might spark envy or loyalty. He had rooms just for viewing, and rooms just for thinking about viewing. Some exchanged poems that read like confessions, some built towers where they met in the dark and dismissed the sun. For the comfort of candlelight, each woman carried a family S. Ambition, a region S. Hope, a minister, S-fear. Some preferred paintings to people, some wrote poetry to imaginary women, some slept alone for years even when surrounded by hundreds of candidates. Desire was fickle, and the burden of being desired even more. So the last emperor, Pui, lived in a palace without power, a figurehead in robes that no longer commanded obedience. He watched Western films in private, and kept a journal that no one read. He had wives and concubines, but he was not a god, and he knew it. His obsession was memory, and his tragedy was that history had already forgotten. The Emperor's choice shaped everything, and so his desires were courted and his habits studied. Some concubines were trained from childhood to appeal to him. Some were spies, some were scholars, some were simply beautiful and lucky. These stories survive only in rumor, in torn pages, in suspiciously beautiful descriptions of unnamed attempts. He once ordered an ancient vase destroyed because he believed it had been misattributed, and he could not bear a lie in beauty. His sleep was monitored. His food weighed, his pulse recorded like a ritual. The emperors are gone, but their obsessions echo through painted screens and faded silk and half-remembered melodies from a time when desire could make or unmake an empire. He dressed like a monk and punished but he obsessed over loyalty and betrayal to the point of madness. He dreamed of a moral empire but ruled through fear. He died convinced that he had preserved virtue, but his son reversed many of his orders because an empire cannot breathe in chains. He had entire families executed for suspicion of disloyalty. He edited history books to erase insults. He issued a code so strict that ministers feared to speak, and when he died his son found notes hidden beneath floor tiles. Entire essays on the nature of obedience and the fear of being unloved. She was his poem and his policy. And when rebellion came, it was her neck they demanded. He pretended to be a merchant, a soldier, a farmer, anything but a ruler. He carved out a private theatre from the marble of his obligations and performed pleasure like a role he could not forget. He sired no heir, and when he died the court tried to erase the record of his obsessions. But the garden remained, and the actors whispered his name through rouge-stained lips. Her beauty became a debt, and he paid it with her life. The emperor is not alone, though he is always solitary. His concubines lie in wings that curve like petals around his chambers. But of dreams, men flying on cranes, women sprouting from lotus flowers, monks whispering secrets into the ears of tigers. He wore plain robes in public, but kept silks, embroidered with storms and skeletons beneath them. He commissioned a room of silence, where no one spoke, and the walls were lined with paper to absorb every breath, each one chosen for her beauty, her blood, her bearing, her horoscope. They wait in stillness, like instruments waiting to be played. Their hair is combed, their bodies bathed, their breath measured. Their names are inscribed on jade tablets that are turned each night by eunuchs, who know more of the emperor's rhythm than the stars do. He had her image carved into jade and ivory and silk. He burned incense in her memory and avoided the places where she used to laugh. He wrote no laws that year, but he wrote a poem, and in that poem she still lives. Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty had a name that meant profound and noble, but he is remembered for love, not law, for music, not mandate, for one woman above all others. Her name was young Gaifei, and the empire paused when she entered the room. Her skin was said to glow with moonlight, her dance to melt the snow on plum blossoms. He had hundreds of concubines, but only one mattered, and because of that the court grew restless, the army mutinous, and the balance of heaven shifted. He built her palaces and bathed her in scented waters. The emperor wept, but kept ruling, because an empire does not stop for heartbreak, not even divine heartbreak. Centuries later, in another dynasty, another emperor would fall to the same desire. He built boats on palace ponds and filled them with dancers. Not all obsessions were for women or for joy. Some were for control. Emperor Xuanzong of the Qing dynasty ruled with precision that bordered on madness, but even he had a hidden world in his private quarters. He kept paintings, not of landscapes. His obsession was not with bodies, but with meaning. He feared chaos more than rebellion, feared ambiguity more than enemies. Other emperors had simpler fixations. The emperor loved collecting more than ruling. He filled halls with scrolls, bronzes, jade, and ink. He visited concubines, but preferred his antiques. There were emperors who loved art, and those who loved war, and those who loved men more than women. Hesitate to say so, some kept male favorites in palaces of their own. Pleasure was always a political act in the palace. Every embrace could birth a dynasty, or destroy one. Every affection could shift alliances. Even emperors who were ascetics had obsessions. The emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty, banned music in court, banned alcohol, banned lavish robes, and yet he loved to write. He composed essays and poems and edicts in calligraphy that grew more erratic with time. The imperial harem was not merely a collection of lovers, but a constellation of influence. But some emperors grew tired of the game. They ordered dolls made in the image of their favorite concubines, lifelike and unchanging. As the dynasties faded and the world modernized, emperors still obsessed, but their stage grew smaller, and yet their shadows remain. The gardens still bloom. The poems still breathe. The jade tablets still sleep in drawers, unopened but not unmourned. She did not know she would be the last. Not at first. Not when the gates opened and the palanquin drifted past the palace walls like a cloud trailing jasmine and nerves. Her hair was heavy with pins and oils, her breath rehearsed into stillness. Her name had been chosen not by her parents, but by the court, because names had to match the calendar and the wind and the emperor's hour of waking. She was given a room with a red curtain and a bronze mirror that held more truth than she ever dared ask. She learned the emperor's titles before she ever saw his face: Son of Heaven, Lord of 10,000 years, Master of the 5 blessings. She recited them nightly. Even as she slept, some tried to gain favor through songs, through beauty, through clever games of chess and suggestion. But the emperor grew tired or ill or distant, and the harem became a garden of unopened letters waiting for a reply that never came. The palace echoed with waiting. She was 16, and the world she left behind was smaller than the hairpin in her bun. She accepted them with bowed head and silent thanks. She kept them in a box. She never opened the emperor, sent no more messages. And still, she was told she was lucky. She passed rooms. She had never entered courtyards she had only seen from afar. They saw a woman in fine robes, with tired eyes and silence in her step. She wandered for hours or days. She found a temple and slept beside a statue of Guanyin. She dreamed of the emperor. Hand on hers, his gaze now empty, his smile now frozen. She visited once in secret. She stood before the mirror in her old room and did not recognize herself. She left a hairpin beneath the window for memory, not for mourning. Her hair still black, her lips still silent. The people at the tea-house buried her in a simple grave with no marker. They remembered her as gentle, as still as rain in spring. She dreamed of a world where she had been more than chosen. She dreamed of her real name, the one she had forgotten. She reached the inner gate and found it open. The guards were gone. The world beyond waited without ceremony. The other women began to fear her. Some envied her, some pitied her, all avoided her. She poured tea and listened to conversations about revolution and reform and railroads. She watched young women laugh without bows. She watched men speak without reverence. She said little, but saw everything. A scholar once remarked that she had the grace of a noble woman. She smiled and served him more tea. It had no name, no title, no signature, just lines about a room without doors, and a dream without end. No one found it. No one needed to. She was not allowed to see the body. She was not allowed to cry. She was told to wait. She waited until the curtains faded, until her room smelled of mildew and forgotten prayers. The tea-house changed, owners changed, names changed decor, but she remained pouring tea and watching people who did not know they walked on bones. Then one day the servants did not come. The food did not arrive. The silence became complete. Inside the forbidden city, silence pressed against her skin like a second robe. The emperor grew weaker. The emperors grew watchful. The servants whispered behind screens, and the eunuchs prayed to gods they no longer believed. The empress said nothing. A eunuch wept. Another servant offered her tea, but would not meet her gaze. She was still favored, still housed, still clothed in silks, but her purpose had dissolved like ink in rain. She walked the halls like a ghost without history. She slept in a bed carved for the pleasure of gods, and woke with the taste of dust on her lips. The forbidden city was not so forbidden anymore, and the silk began to unravel. The eunuchs whispered but did not speak. The emperor was no longer emperor, but he still lived in the palace. His titles remained, but meant less than the wind. The court still performed rituals for no audience. The musicians played for no one. The concubines dressed in silence for a man who no longer ruled. The concubines bowed but did not look. The corridors stretched like dreams without end. Every surface gleamed, every step was remembered. The rooms smelled of lacquer and fear and something older than either. The Empress did not smile when she was presented, but neither did she frown. She was told she was lucky. She was told she was honored. She was chosen, and she repeated these truths until they no longer held weight. She stopped counting days. She started naming shadows. The pomegranate tree outside her window became her confidant. She simply nodded as though accepting weather of fate. They taught her to walk without sound, to smile without hunger, to bathe as if water might report her sins. The emperor was older than her father and quieter than her shadow. He came once and did not stay long. His eyes were unreadable. His voice was dry like old paper. He touched her hair and then her hand and then left. She was marked as favored, but she never saw him again. She waited for weeks, for months, for seasons. Her title was elevated. Her servants doubled. Her meals grew richer, but the room remained hers alone. She filled the days with calligraphy, with embroidery, with poems written and burned. She learned to listen for rumors hidden in fan clicks and coughs and footsteps. Other concubines came and went, some in glory, some in sorrow. One vanished overnight and her room was sealed. She was given gifts she did not want. A comb of pearl, a robe of gold thread, a necklace heavy enough to drown. The seasons turned. The politics outside, the palace grew louder. The walls trembled with change. Men came with Western suits and foreign words and new ideas. She heard one day that the dynasty had ended, but no one said it directly. She asked once what that made her. The emperor died on a quiet morning with no proclamation and no ritual. She dressed herself in the robe of her presentation day. She combed her hair without oil. She took one of the gifts, a flute carved from sandalwood, and walked the corridors alone. She walked into the city, dressed as a concubine, with nowhere to go. The people did not recognize her in time. She took work in a tea house, where no one asked questions. The palace became a museum. Tourists walked the halls. She once feared children, pointed at robes like the ones she had worn. Paintings of the emperor hung in rooms where she had wept. She lived a long time, longer than she expected. She never married, never bore children, never spoke of the palace. One evening she wrote a poem on rice paper and set it adrift in the river. She died in her sleep, with her hands folded as if in prayer or patience. And somewhere in the Forbidden City, behind a screen, behind a wall, behind history, there is a hairpin that no one moves, and a room that smells faintly of jasmine and waiting. They said the palace had rules that even the gods could not bend, but people are not gods, and rules, when left unwatched, begin to soften, like rice left in warm rain. There were scrolls locked in bronze cabinets, scripts of protocol and punishment, charts of who could touch whom, and when, and why, and where. But scrolls do not watch, and ink does not speak, unless summoned by breath or betrayal. Behind the lacquered doors of the Forbidden City, among its 9,000 rooms and haunted corridors, the forbidden was never far away, only renamed, only redressed, only barely concealed beneath robes of righteousness. There were men who loved men, and this was not always spoken and never openly praised, but history kept its ledger with care. The Han Emperor Ai, who once cut his sleeve rather than disturb his sleeping lover, Dongxian, or the whispered courtiers in the temples, whose silken glances carried more weight than any decree. Officially, such love was outlawed under codes that named it unclean, but unofficially it danced through poetry, through paintings, through midnight conversations in the peach garden behind the Hall of Mirrors. It was called the Passion of the Cut Sleeve, or the Twin Lotuses Blooming, and it endured in corners where the emperor's shadow did not reach, but even the emperor's gaze was not always enough to prevent desire from slipping where it was unwelcome. There were guards with strong arms and lonely eyes. There were eunuchs who, though castrated, were not heartless, and concubines who, despite rank and silks, longed for laughter or defiance, or simply the thrill of saying no and then yes. Many a concubine met a glance, not her emperor's, and returned it, and in such return began a story that might end in exile, or worse, the punishments for transgression were clear and terrifying. A concubine who broke the rules might be quietly removed, sent to a nunnery in the mountains, where prayers would outlast memory, or she might drink poison, or walk into the garden and never return. The guards who touched what they must not could be executed with silence. The eunuchs could be flayed, or suffocated, or written out of the records as if they had never been. The court was a place where history was a performance, and the unscripted scene was a mortal offense, and yet still it happened, because the body forgets fear when touched just right, and desire does not read laws. One concubine of the Ming was said to have orchestrated a romance with her handmaid, smuggling letters within lotus roots, and meeting beneath the pavilions at dusk. They were discovered when the handmaid gave birth to a child that could not be explained. A scandal like a drop of ink into milk, it spread until both were removed from the palace. Their names were never spoken again. Another tale tells of a eunuch in the Qing dynasty who fell in love with a concubine already out of favor. They met in the library, exchanging poetry and glances, until they were betrayed by the sound of laughter overheard by a servant. The eunuch was strangled, and the concubine vanished. It was said that the emperor ordered their names carved onto a single stone, but then ordered the stone buried. Such stories did not make the official records, but they floated in court. gossip in the letters of visiting scholars, in the margins of medical manuals where scribes doodled lotus blossoms and serpents entangled. There were dreams that went unspoken and touches that lingered to long and silences between servants that held entire lives of unfulfilled hunger. The forbidden city was forbidden, not just to outsiders, but to truths that did not serve the dynasty. The rituals of intimacy between emperor and concubine were so tightly controlled that even deviation within that narrow window was scandalous. There were prescribed days for conception based on the stars and the balance of yin and yang. There were rules about which rank could approach the imperial bed, and in what robe, and at what hour, and how many steps. From the bed she must pause, but sometimes the emperor chose otherwise. And when he did, it was considered a scandal of a different kind, especially if he favored someone considered too low, or too foreign, or too old. One emperor famously favored a dancer with no official rank, refusing the higher concubines in favor of her nightly visits. She was blamed for his distraction during a key military loss, and later executed not for love, but for politics. Another scandal arose when an empress caught her husband visiting a concubine outside the scheduled rotation. She confronted him, not in rage, but in ritual, leaving her headdress on the imperial bed to signify that the order of heaven had been broken. The emperor exiled her instead of the concubine, and the court trembled with the implications. Sometimes the scandals were not of love, but of power. Some concubines became too beloved, wielding influence over appointments and decrees. Some wrote letters to foreign dignitaries, others smuggled jade or pearls from the treasury to bribe officials. One used her beauty as a mask for treason, working with her brother to plot a coup that was discovered only by accident when a parrot trained to repeat their plans spoke too clearly in the presence of a eunuch. The bird was killed, the brother was executed, the concubine was made to vanish. There were scandals too in the realm of medicine, where sex was supposed to be ritual but sometimes crossed into obsession. An emperor in the late Ming was said to have exhausted himself with alchemical acts, sleeping with multiple concubines in a single night as part of a formula for immortality. He died young and pale and confused, and the concubines who had been part of his regimen were dismissed. With no pension, their names were recorded not as women, but as ingredients in a failed potion oven. The structure of the palace itself hinted at these transgressions. There were secret doors in the whole of mental cultivation, corridors that twisted away from official paths, mirrors that concealed viewing holes used by eunuchs, or perhaps the emperor himself, to watch without being seen. The architecture was a testament to the idea that even within ritual there must be space for the forbidden, as if the court knew that without temptation duty would rot from within. Some scandals were so strange they became legend, like the tale of the concubine who pretended to be pregnant, hiding pillows under her robe, hoping to gain favor and perhaps the throne. When discovered, she laughed instead of weeping, saying only that she wished to know what it felt like to be revered, even if briefly. She was banished not for the lie, but for the laughter, or the story of the emperor who ordered his concubines to perform erotic theater, dressed as animals to amuse him while drunk on plum wine. This was recorded in a eunuch's diary, discovered centuries later in a box labeled Rice Accounts. The performance was said to involve masks and ropes, and left the emperor unconscious for 3 days, whether from delight or shame, no one knew. And then there were the quiet scandals, the ones no one spoke of because they did not fit the narrative. A concubine who wrote poetry about her female lover under the guise of describing flowers, a eunuch who became a confidant to the empress, and perhaps something more, a guard who left behind a journal detailing His years watching and never touching, and the longing that became a form of madness, these stories were not preserved by decree but by accident, and when found, they felt like confessions written to the wind. As the dynasties declined, the scandals became more frequent, or perhaps just more visible. Western visitors brought with them cameras and newspapers, and a hunger for the exotic and the shameful. The last emperor was photographed riding a bicycle, while his concubines peered from behind curtains, wondering if history had finally become ridiculous. The fall of the court did not end scandal. It only made it mundane. But still the forbidden acts echo through time, not as sins, but as symptoms of a system so tightly wound that it invited its own unraveling. The forbidden city was both theatre and prison, and in such a place the human heart will always find a way to slip through the cracks, to bloom where it should not, and to leave behind the faint scent of rebellion. They said the palace had rules that even the gods could not bend, but people are not gods, and rules, when left unwatched, begin to soften, like rice left in warm rain. There were scrolls, locked in bronze cabinets, scripts of protocol and punishment, charts of who could touch whom, and when, and why, and where. But scrolls do not watch, and ink does not speak, unless summoned by breath or betrayal. Behind the lacquered doors of the forbidden city, among its 9,000 rooms and haunted corridors, the forbidden was never far away, only renamed, only redressed, only barely concealed beneath robes of righteousness. There were men who loved men, and this was not always spoken and never openly praised, but history kept its ledger with care. The Han Emperor Ai, who once cut his sleeve rather than disturb his sleeping lover Dong Sheon, or the whispered courtiers in the Thames, whose silken glances carried more weight than any decree. Officially, such love was outlawed under codes that named it unclean, but unofficially it danced through poetry, through paintings, through midnight conversations, in the peach garden behind the Hall of Mirrors. It was called the Passion of the Cut Sleeve, or the Twin Lotuses blooming, and it endured in corners where the emperor's shadow did not reach. But even the emperor's gaze was not always enough to prevent desire from slipping where it was unwelcome. There were guards with strong arms and lonely eyes. There were eunuchs who, though castrated, were not heartless, and concubines who, despite rank and silks, longed for laughter or defiance, or simply the thrill of saying no and then yes. Many a concubine met a glance, not her emperor's, and returned it, and in such return began a story that might end in exile, or worse, the punishments for transgression were clear and terrifying. A concubine who broke the rules might be quietly removed, sent to a nunnery in the mountains, where prayers would outlast memory, or she might drink poison, or walk into the garden and never return. The guards who touched what they must not could be executed with silence. The eunuchs could be flayed, or suffocated, or written out of the records as if they had never been. The court was a place where history was a performance, and the unscripted scene was a mortal offense, yet still it happened, because the body forgets fear when touched just right, and desire does not read laws. One concubine of the Ming was said to have orchestrated a romance with her handmaid, smuggling letters within lotus roots and meeting beneath the pavilions. At dusk they were discovered when the handmaid gave birth to a child that could not be explained. A scandal like a drop of ink into milk, it spread until both were removed from the palace. Their names were never spoken again. Another tale tells of a eunuch in the Qing dynasty who fell in love with a concubine already out of favor. They met in the library, exchanging poetry and glances, until they were betrayed by the sound of laughter, overheard by a servant. The eunuch was strangled, and the concubine vanished. It was said that the emperor ordered their names carved onto a single stone, but then ordered the stone Buried such stories did not make the official records, but they floated in court. Gossip in the letters of visiting scholars, in the margins of medical manuals, where scribes doodled lotus blossoms and serpents entangled. There were dreams that went unspoken, and touches that lingered too long, and silences between servants that held entire lives of unfulfilled hunger. The forbidden city was forbidden not just to outsiders, but to truths that did not serve the dynasty. The rituals of intimacy between emperor and concubine were so tightly controlled that even deviation within that narrow window was scandalous. There were prescribed days for conception based on the stars and the balance of yin and yang. There were rules about which rank could approach the imperial bed, and in what robe, and at what hour, and how many steps from the bed she must pause. But sometimes the emperor chose otherwise, and when he did, it was considered a scandal of a different kind, especially if he favored someone considered too low, or too foreign, or too old. One emperor famously favored a dancer with no official rank, refusing the higher concubines in favor of her nightly visits. She was blamed for his distraction during a key military loss, and later executed not for love but for politics. Another scandal arose when an empress caught her husband visiting a concubine outside the scheduled rotation. She confronted him, not in rage, but in ritual, leaving her headdress on the imperial bed to signify that the order of heaven had been broken. The emperor exiled her instead of the concubine, and the court trembled with the implications. Sometimes the scandals were not of love, but of power. Some concubines became too beloved, wielding influence over appointments and decrees. Some wrote letters to foreign dignitaries, others smuggled jade or pearls from the treasury to bribe officials. One used her beauty as a mask for treason, working with her brother to plot a coup that was discovered only by accident when a parrot trained to repeat their plans spoke too clearly in the presence of a eunuch. The bird was killed, the brother was executed, the concubine was made to vanish. There were scandals too in the realm of medicine, where sex was supposed to be ritual but sometimes crossed into obsession. An emperor in the late Ming was said to have exhausted himself with alchemical acts, sleeping with multiple concubines in a single night as part of a formula for immortality. He died young and pale and confused, and the concubines who had been part of his regimen were dismissed. With no pension, their names were recorded, not as women, but as ingredients in a failed potion. Even the structure of the palace itself hinted at these transgressions. There were secret doors in the hall of mental cultivation, corridors that twisted away from official paths, mirrors that concealed viewing holes used by eunuchs, or perhaps the emperor himself, to watch without being seen. The architecture was a testament to the idea that even within ritual there must be space for the forbidden, as if the court knew that without temptation duty would rot from within. Some scandals were so strange they became legend, like the tale of the concubine who pretended to be pregnant, hiding pillows under her robe, hoping to gain favor and perhaps the throne. When discovered, she laughed instead of weeping, saying only that she wished to know what it felt like to be revered, even if briefly she was banished, not for the lie but for the laughter. The story of the emperor who ordered his concubines to perform erotic theater dressed as animals to amuse him while drunk on plum wine. This was recorded in a eunuch's diary, discovered centuries later in a box labeled Rice Accounts. The performance was said to involve masks and ropes, and left the emperor unconscious for 3 days, whether from delight or shame no one knew. And then there were the quiet scandals, the ones no one spoke of because they did not fit the narrative. A concubine who wrote poetry about her female lover under the guise of describing flowers, a eunuch who became a confidant to the Empress, and perhaps something more, a guard who left behind a journal detailing His years watching and never touching, and the longing that became a form of madness. These stories were not preserved by decree but by accident, and when found, they felt like confessions written to the windows. The dynasties declined, the scandals became more frequent, or perhaps just more visible. Western visitors brought with them cameras and newspapers, and a hunger for the exotic and the shameful. The last emperor was photographed riding a bicycle, while his concubines peered from behind curtains, wondering if history had finally become ridiculous. The fall of the court did not end scandal. It only made it mundane. But still, the forbidden acts echo through time, not as sins, but as symptoms of a system so tightly wound that it invited its own unraveling. The Forbidden City was both theatre and prison, and in such a place the human heart will always find a way to slip through the cracks, to bloom where it should not, and to leave behind the faint scent of rebellion. It began not with screams or fire, but with sighs in hallways that no longer echoed. The light filtered differently through the paper screens, and no one knew why. Some said it was a shift in the season, or the dust in the air, but others whispered that the gods had turned their heads away. There were scandals, yes, but not the kind written in scrolls. These were stories that passed only in glances, in hands that shook too long. When they handed over robes, in prayers that trembled when spoken too quickly, there were bruises hidden by sleeves and silences guarded like treasure. The empire had learned long ago how to cloak its shame in incense and protocol. There were priests who preached chastity while locking the doors behind them. There were ministers who quoted virtue while trading daughters like coins. The temple walls held confessions written in reverse, scratched behind paintings of bodhisattvas who watched with eyes too wide to be innocent. One monk was found in the lotus pond, his robe soaked through his mouth full of lilies. They said he had been mad, or holy, or both. He had written on his chest with ash, "Let none of them touch the stars again." The burden of obedience fell heaviest on those who could not speak. The concubines, the novices, the second wives, the servant girls. They learned early to smile with their eyes lowered, to answer with gratitude even when their hands were bleeding. Some were told they were vessels for heaven's grace, others that they were born to absorb the sins of men. Most did not remember their own names, only the titles given to them by those who claimed to love them. They folded their pain into cloth and wore it like an extra layer beneath their robes. One concubine wrote of a night when the emperor called her to his chamber, not for pleasure, but for punishment. He asked her to kneel and recite the poems of loyalty while he watched from behind a screen. She did not know what she had done. She never learned. The next day she was given a new name, and no one spoke of it again. She buried her old name beneath the roots of a bonsai tree, and sometimes she swore it whispered back to her. When the wind was strong enough, there were popes across the sea who excommunicated each other over questions of wine and doctrine and the placement of chairs. There were holy wars waged in whispers and gestures, where the true crime was having an opinion too early or too late. One bishop accused another of heresy because his robes were too clean. Another declared that angels had told him in a dream that he alone could absolve the emperor. When questioned, he wept and said the angels had changed their minds. They were all absolved anyway. In the cloisters, the nuns sometimes carved symbols into their cell walls. Not prayers, but questions. One etched the word why in 100 languages she had never learned. Another wrote a list of names, then crossed them out one by one as if erasing history by hand. A third painted over her mirror so she would not be forced to see the thing she had become. They prayed every morning, with voices hollowed out by habit. They believed, or pretended to. Some said that God had stopped listening, others that he had never started. When a scandal rose too high, it was not destroyed, but drowned, covered in layers of silence. A bishop who fathered 7 children was sent to a distant outpost. A monk who confessed to touching the sick too tenderly was declared a saint after his death. A priest who whispered love poems to a young choir boy vanished one winter, and the snow refused to melt in the courtyard where he had last been seen. His robes were found beneath the bell tower, folded as if he had simply evaporated. Those who spoke out were silenced, their words rewritten, their lives shortened. A scribe who questioned the emperor's spending was declared mad and confined to a tower. A servant who accused a nobleman of cruelty disappeared during a pilgrimage. A concubine who begged to leave the palace was given a new title and locked in a room without windows. She scratched a song into the wall with her fingernails, and sang it until her voice cracked like porcelain. Even the buildings began to forget. Temples collapsed and were rebuilt without memory. Paintings were restored, but the faces altered. Statues lost their hands or their eyes, and no one replaced them. The scrolls that documented misdeeds were stored in archives that burned mysteriously or were eaten by rats that never left droppings. When historians came, they found only fragments, and those too crumbled when touched. In some convents, the walls held breath too long. The women there had once been artists, or lovers, or dreamers. They were now silent. Their letters intercepted, their art painted over. One nun wrote in the margin of a hymn book, "I remember what it was to be real." Her page was torn out the next day. Another stitched her story into the hem of her robe, but the cloth was burned when she died. A third whispered to the wind and hoped that someone outside the walls could hear her and write it all down. Convents became more than cloisters. They became places to hide secrets, not just of faith, but of shame. Daughters who were too beautiful or too curious. Women who read too much. Sisters who loved the wrong people. They were placed in rooms with soft bedding and hard rules. Some were told they were holy, others that they were cursed. Many forgot which was which. They prayed not for salvation, but for forgetfullness. The hierarchy taught that suffering was a virtue and obedience the highest form of grace. Those who suffered most were said to be closest to the divine. And so, when a girl wept behind the altar, no one asked why. When a concubine flinched at the emperor's touch, no one stopped him. When a novice disappeared, her belongings were given to the next without ceremony. It was easier to believe that heaven was watching than to accept that it might be blind. There were stories of miracles, too. A nun who healed the sick with her hands until they bound them. A concubine whose dreams came true until they drugged her. A monk who spoke with animals until they burned his journals. Each miracle became a threat, and so each was buried. The faithful were taught to believe in miracles, but only the kind that left no trace. In time, the incense grew thicker, not from devotion, but from fear. People burned offerings, not out of love, but desperation. The altars became cluttered with gifts no one wanted. Gold coins, hair strands, teeth, anything to be seen, anything to be spared. The gods, if they were there, remained silent. Or perhaps they had never spoken, and it had always been the wind. Some say that silence is holy, that it is in the stillness that the divine appears. But this silence was not peace. It was a weight, a drowning, a forgetting. The palace forgot the faces of the concubines. The convent forgot the dreams of its girls. The church forgot the sins of its priests. And everyone forgot the cost of pretending. Now the halls are quiet. The beds are empty. The prayers continue, but no one listens. The statues remain, but their eyes have worn smooth. The records end mid-sentence, the voices fade. The silence grows heavier with each breath, and yet, somewhere beneath the dust, a single word remains carved into stone, where no one dares look. Remember, but you have remembered tonight. You have listened. You have walked the corridors and traced the faded ink and heard the voices buried under centuries of silence. You have carried their sorrow into your own breath and made space for them where once there was none. Now let that weight fall away. Let the silence wrap you not in dread but in rest. Let your eyes close and your breath slow and your heart drift toward stillness. Let the shadows become softer. Let the voices fade like smoke. Sleep now. Sleep because remembering is painful and forgetting has always been easier. Good night.